Hello, friends. I control the gun with my telekinesis. Oh no. Why did this happen? Why? Be sure to subscribe to my channel. A young woman of 18, Anna, sliced the pig's neck open so quickly, the animal barely had time to be afraid before it was dead. She cradled it for a moment there on the ground, then closed its eyes and whispered something into its ear. She hauled it up onto the wheelbarrow, on top of a goat's lifeless body. She did this so effortlessly, it looked like she was tossing a sack of dead leaves, rather than a full-grown pig. She took the wheelbarrow back behind the house to add to the rest. That night, Anna wrote in her journal. She wrote by candlelight in her kitchen, the only light glowing in the farmhouse. Everything was dark for miles but for that one candle and her troubled face glowing in its light. She was not often inspired to write, but when she was, it poured out of her in great waves. She wrote quickly, her hand throbbing with the effort. Her final entry that night was a memory. It said, "Ever since I was a little girl, my father told me stories of the gods. They were beautiful, golden chariots blazing fire through the sky, powerful, eternal beings playing tricks on men, transforming into animals to gain access into mortal lives. There were creatures that tempted men from cliff tops, beckoning them to sail towards shore to their deaths, and a woman with snakes for hair that could turn a man to stone with a single look. There were men who were half animal, roaming forests and mazes. There lived gods on thrones high in the clouds, debating and scheming over the lives of mortal creatures. The stories captivated me. I wanted to believe there was magic in the world, something more than the simple life we lived on our farm. My father made me believe. He treated his books like holy relics and often read to me at night just before I went to sleep when my imagination could run off at full speed. I believed them all." In the nearby town, just a few miles away from Amna and her solitude, a young boy, about 13 years old, named Joseph, was sneaking out of his mother's trailer and into the surrounding woods with the stealth of a cat. He had done this many times before. He headed, as always, to the little bunker he had made for himself in the woods. He often slept in his little hiding place when his mother had a man over. The bunker was about half a mile into the woods behind their trailer. It was partly made from the remains of an old shack that had toppled over long before Joseph was born. He fixed it up and put the door back on with some hinges he had saved up for. He made extra money collecting recyclables and sweeping up for some of the local businesses. Sometimes, he restocked books at the library as well. He used a tarp for insulation and heaps of blankets and pillows that he collected from the dump and some from his bedroom. He would have to sneak those back to the trailer with him in the morning, so his mother wouldn't notice that they are gone. He thought that one day he would probably run away for good if things kept going the way they were going. Joseph often skipped school, treed in his bunker, and no one seemed to care. Not the school, not his mother. He had no friends at school. He was smaller than most of the other kids, but mostly he thought they didn't like him because his family was poor, and everyone knew about his mother and how his father went crazy right before he was born and disappeared into the night. At least, that's what the rumor was. All Joseph knew for sure is that he had never met his father, and after asking about him one time when he was 6 years old, his mother slapped him so hard he saw stars. Joseph started whistling a little tune when he was clear of the trailer. He was glad to get away from the nauseating sounds coming from his mother's bedroom, if you could call it a bedroom. It was just a bed separated from the kitchen by a curtain. The kids at school called his mother a whore. He didn't believe what they said, but he knew he couldn't stand to be around when the men were there at night. They smelled of liquor and cigarettes and desperation. He arrived at his bunker and took the matches out of the small tin in the corner. He lit the lantern that he hung from a hook in the ceiling and turned it up high. He liked the solitude of the woods, but he was also afraid of it. He didn't like the dark, and yet it was his sanctuary, so he kept a small lantern burning all night while he read his books and slept. He thought he probably wouldn't go to school the next day. It was already 4 o'clock in the morning and he hadn't had a wink of sleep yet. Also, he thought Alan might show up the next day and read with him. Joseph was very excited about his new friend, Alan, a man that visited him at his bunker every week. They met in the woods one day while Joseph was fishing at the beginning of the summer. Alan worked at the plastics factory one town over and liked to fish as well. He was quiet, but smart and knew all the best places to fish nearby. He also knew lots of jokes and sometimes brought comic books and candy for Joseph when they spent the afternoon together. Joseph wasn't sure why Alan wanted to hang out with a kid or why he had so many of the same interests as him. In his experience, adults only liked boring stuff. Alan was different, and Joseph didn't mind that he was middle-aged. It was nice to have a friend, especially one that was from another town. The townspeople where Joseph lived were all the same. They all seemed to look at each other out of the corner of their eyes. No one trusted anyone, and until Alan, Joseph thought that was just the way of things. But now that he got to talk to Alan every week, he felt that his town was maybe just too rotten one. Maybe other towns didn't have whatever disease he did, one where people kept their heads down and doors locked. The next morning, Alan arrived with a huge sack over his shoulder and a grin on his face. He was about 6 feet 0 inches, a giant to Joseph, with messy brown hair that had grown down over his ears and big brown eyes that were a little bit watery, but always kind. His teeth were yellow, and his brown corduroy jacket had holes in it, but he always smelled nice. It was some kind of cologne that smelled like pine and flowers all mixed into one. Joseph heard his footsteps crunching through the dead leaves nearby. He opened the door to his bunker to see Alan striding up with his hand waving in the air with great enthusiasm. "Hiya, Joe," Alan said and ruffled Joseph's hair. "Glad to see ya here. Does your mother know you're not at school?" "I don't think she cares. She's probably still asleep," Joseph said, wiping the sleepiness from his eyes and shivering in the bunker doorway. "Mind if I sit inside while we catch up?" "It's awfully chilly this morning," Alan said with his permanent grin. "I figure our fishing days are probably over until spring." "Sure. I have a new comic book," Joseph said as he walked back into the bunker and rooted around the blankets for it. Alan glanced around at the surrounding woods and then crouched down and shuffled through the doorway. He shut the door behind him and turned the latch to lock it. He looked around the boys' little clubhouse. It had a few sad little drawings of what looked like superheroes and animals taped to the walls. One of them looked like a wolf, but it was standing on 2 legs with red eyes. Another looked like a muscular pit bull with sharp teeth and a pool of drool at its feet. Blankets and pillows were strewn everywhere. There was an old tattered, leather-bound copy of Edgar Allan Poe's complete works, some old, tattered Goosebumps books, as well as stacks of comic books. "Wow, that's a big book for such a young man," Alan said, chuckling and looking through the Poe book. "You must be very, very smart." "Yeah, well, I can't understand most of it, but it seems really creepy and also sort of beautiful, you know?" He said this a trifle bashfully. Joseph would never talk about such things with other kids and especially not with his mother. you've got that right. I remember reading some of these when I was not much older than you. There's one story about a guy who kills an old man in his sleep because he thinks his eye is watching him, judging him. He sneaks into the old man's room in the dark and murders him. Afterward, he's so happy he did it because he knows the old man's eye will never judge him again. Then he must bury the body underneath the floorboards so that he won't get in trouble with the police. But then, Alan took a more serious tone and crouched down towards Joseph's face. He starts to hear the old man's heart beating, louder and louder. It drives him insane. He ends up revealing his crime to the cops because he just can't stand the heart beating and beating, judging his sins, Alan said, relishing the story and the way it made the boy back away a little in awe. Whoa! That's really creepy. Why didn't he just move out of that place, or bury the body somewhere else? Joseph said. Well, sometimes when a person does something like that, like take someone's life, they can't ever get away from it, in their mind I mean. Did you know that some murderers go back to the scene of the crime over and over because they want to savor it maybe, or understand why they did it, why they needed to do it? Alan said. Joseph stood staring at him, and for the first time felt a little scared of Alan. He didn't like being in this tiny, dark space with him. They usually played in the woods and talked about fishing and bird calls and Superman and the X-Men. Hey kid, why the long face? Alan said. Or, nothing apostrophe ... I should get back home though. I need to help my mom with something. Without seeing what I brought ya, Alan said and shook the sack he had brought in. Oh okay, what it is? Alan dumped the contents of the sack on the blanket in front of Joseph. 5 brand new X-Men comic books, a bag of gummy bears, some chocolate bars, and 2 cans of Coke tumbled out. Wow! No way? This is for me? Yepers. You're such a good friend to me and I didn't want you to be bored while I'm not around, so here you go. Alan smiled down at the boy with such warmth that all of Joseph's worries about his friend seemed to melt away. Thank you so much. He got up and hugged Alan. He felt then that maybe Alan was less like a friend and more like a father. Maybe he even was his father, who knew? He had heard the stories about his father disappearing in the woods, wandering out into the wilderness naked and raving mad, but kids were mean, and adults were liars, so screw them all. He had Alan. Alan brought him things and made him feel loved. Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Can I read them now? He said. Sure can, kid. Here, hand me one and we can read in here together. There's plenty of light with your little lantern contraption here. The 2 of them got comfortable and spent the afternoon reading comics and eating candy, and Joseph felt the strain and sadness of his life at home drift away like a fading dream. Overhead, a hawk was circling, shrieking into the new daylight as it hunted for prey. It was October and the animals and farmers were preparing to harvest their final crops before winter descended upon them all. Anna started her work earlier than usual that morning. She couldn't sleep. Her nightmares had started up about 3 weeks before. They came almost every night. Her muscles ached in the morning from thrashing in her bed. Her eyes were puffy with tears. That night she had dreamt of her father. He was running in front of her and she was chasing him. They were running through the trees. He kept looking over his shoulder at her and she saw fear in his eyes. Then he was shrinking down, smaller and smaller until he was as small as a mouse running through the forest. She was flying, high above him, gaining on him. She was above the trees now and he was nothing but an ant. She flew faster and faster and the wind whipped through her wings. At last, she dove down, like a knife cutting through the air. Her eyes saw everything. They saw his fear as he ran from her. She saw others too. There were other mice running from her every which way, seeking shelter. Her father started to get bigger and bigger as she got closer and closer to the ground. He stopped and screamed, covering his dirt-smeared face with his hands. It looked like she would plummet right into the ground, but at the last moment, she angled up and snatched him up with her legs that had become talons. Her colossal brown wings pounded the air and lifted them up into the sky with ease. She soared over the trees with his writhing body in her claws. "Mercy!" he screamed. "No," she answered and ripped his head off and tossed it into the air. It came back down, severed neck dripping, eyes rolled back to the whites and mouth still locked into a grimace of pain. She opened her massive, blood-stained beak and swallowed the tiny man's head whole. In an instant, the sky went black and thick with electricity. She froze mid-air. The headless body of her father slipped from her talons and fell miles and miles back down to earth away from her. She could feel her life force being sucked from her as it gave power to the entities surrounding her. It was everywhere, thick as smoke, touching her and taking from her everything that she was. "I've done what you asked," she choked. She heard laughter tittering around her, sometimes loud and sometimes soft, like music from a radio station too far out of range. Still suspended in the air, she felt the darkness pull the feathers from her body, pluck her eyes from their sockets, and strip the muscle and tendons from her bones. She screeched and cried until nothing was left to scream with. Her hollow skeleton was suspended for a moment more and then dropped down to earth. Her dream flicked off as Anna flung herself from her bed, crying and shaking. The dreams were getting worse, and they were not meaningless. She knew that by now. She stood on trembling legs and threw off her nightgown. She walked down the dark steps of her house, through the near pitch-black living room and out the back door that faced the woods. She walked, naked, straight from the darkness of her house to the gloom of the woods and kept walking. It was harvest time and she had to catch up. He ran away again, that little bastard. Marie looked out of the trailer's window and stared out into the forest. She usually heard him sneak back into the trailer at dawn, but today she found his bed empty. Bet he isn't going to school either, she thought. She looked down at her wrinkled hands. They used to be smooth, elegant even. The morning was edging her into sobriety, and that meant reality. It meant facing the reality of the life she had allowed herself and her son to sink into. She felt emotion well up in her throat and a tear streaked down her face onto one of her yellowed fingernails. She needed a drink. She rummaged through the near-empty cabinets of the trailer, finding nothing but empty whiskey bottles, empty vodka bottles, and then, finally, one blessed finger of gin left in a plastic handle behind the coffee maker. She drank it straight away and felt the burn of the liquor melt away the pain that lived deep down in her belly. Ever since Joseph's father left those 10 years ago, Marie felt that the world was one big outhouse, full of shit and rats and stink. Her childish views of living some semblance of a happy life burned up and turned to hate as soon as Frank wandered out into the wilderness for good. He had always wondered, and to be honest, she had no idea where he went most of the time, but he always came back and always provided for her. When she got pregnant, she felt him grow even more distant, something she hadn't known was possible for him. He meant to leave all along, she supposed. Maybe he had some other family kept up somewhere and her getting knocked up made their situation too real for him. She had been systematically skewing her memories of him since that night. The truth was that she had loved him, in her way, and she thought he might have loved her. It was the way she could feel him looking at her while she slept, and the way he smoothed her hair behind her ear as she lay there, pretending not to know he was watching her. "Fuck it," she said abruptly, gritting her teeth against the hurt. She went to her makeshift bedroom and found a wooden cigar box that she hid under the bed. She sat on the bed and opened it, routing her pointer finger absently through the contents. A few small baggies of weed, a few $10 bills she had gotten from the men who came to her from time to time, and at the bottom, a small brown paper bag. Marie picked up the bag and stared at it for a moment. She put it on the dirty mattress next to her and looked down at the box. On the very bottom was a photograph of her and Frank. It showed a teenage Frank with his arm around Marie and her smiling giddily at the camera with a giant stuffed bear in her arms. Marie closed the box and ripped open the brown paper bag sitting next to her. She laid its contents out on the bed with fingers that were dumb with shaking. She lined up a small baggie full of a brownish powder, a spoon, a piece of rubber housing and a syringe. Outside, a squirrel shrieked as some winged predator scooped it off the ground and carried it up into the clouds.